Okay, here we go. We got right up to the bottom of Daf Yudal of the base yesterday, but we're going to backtrack a little bit because we want to get back into the sugya. So we'll start quickly from the Mishnah. Mokum Mishnahagu Limkar Behemodaka Loibitkocha. The places where the minig was that people would sell behemoths dakos, like goats and sheep, to a goy, moichin you're allowed to. And Malcolm Shahag Shalolim Kar Ein Moichin. Why would they be noig not to? So we already learned, Rashi told us, because goyim will have intimacy with these animals, and there's an Isser, the Rashi, it's one of the Sheva Mitzvahs for the Noach, that it says, that's what's supposed to happen in a marriage, but with a behemoth that could not happen, and therefore there's an Isser. You're not allowed to sell the goy a behemoth daka because you're overlooking the Iver by sending him that opportunity to do the Isser. Okay. However, no matter what the minig is in relationship to a behemoth daka, you're for sure never allowed to sell a goy a behemoth gasa, which is like a cow or an ox or a donkey or a golem or even small animals like a calf, young animals like a calf, siochim, donkeys, shleim, whether they're healthy and complete, ushavurin, or even if they're broken and crippled. But Rabbi Yehuda mater b'shvur. Rabbi Yehuda does allow a broken animal to be sold. And we're going to see in the Gemara. Why? Ben Beseira mater b'sus. Ben Beseira is mater with a sus, and Rashi explains to us, the Gemara is going to have a little bit of discussion about it, is that the problem that the Gemara is going to tell us with selling a behemoth gas to a goy is due to a concern that if you sell an animal to a goy, thank you so much, you might actually rent or lend an animal to a goy. The goy is going to do malacha with your animal, and the person is mitzvah al shvisas behemtai. That's one of the reasons that we're going to see. By sus, there's no problem. Because what does it mean that the behemoth is doing a malacha? If the behemoth will carry a load for you, what if the guy loads up your donkey when he borrows it, and your donkey now carries a load on Shabbos? That violates shvisas behemtai. But on a sus, the norm is not to put packages on a sus. That's what a donkey's for. Sus is normally ridden by a rider. And we know hachai noise esatzmai, and therefore there's only the greatest chashash that the goy might use it by riding it is only in the Rabban anyway, and therefore we're not going to prohibit selling a sus to a goy because of the chashash that he might rent it to a goy. Because even if he rents it to a goy, it's only a Rabbanon, because really hachai noise esatzmai, the horse is not considered carrying something. Okay, so that's the Heilige Mishnah. Thank you very much, Mati. Talk to Gemara. Remember the Surah Laka min Haghudaika. The Mishnah talks about minhagim. Sometimes it's taminic to sell, sometimes it's not. But there's no hard isser to sell a behemoth daka to a goy. And therefore, hechadenag yisur nog, hechadenag hetenog. But Zok Gemara, I'm going to prove to you from a brisa that it's a hard isser and there's no way to leave it to minik, because the Brisa says, you're never, ever allowed to give your animal to be watched by a goy. You know why? We're choshes everywhere. You're never allowed to give an animal to be stored by a goy because we're choshes of reviyah. It doesn't say in different places it's different. It says across the board. And there's no halachic difference between selling to a goy and letting him watch your animal, because reviyah is reviyah, it's the same chash. So if you see from the brashah, there seems to be this across the board for mamid and baby put the goys. By the same token, it should always be also to sell a behemoth daka to a goy. Amarav einachanami makom sheitiru limkois hitiru liyached makom she'asur liyached asur limkor. Our mission, it says that it is mutter to sell to a goy in those places where it's mutter. That means in those places, even the goyim don't have relations with animals. Therefore, in those places, the Braisa's halacha of a mamidim doesn't apply. In fact, in places that the Mishnah is referring to, where you could sell to a goy, you're also allowed to let a goy watch your animal. The brayso that says with a definite isser, ein mamidim behema, that's referring to places where the goyim are chashud to be ravei animals, and in fact, in that place, makom sh'asur liyachid would also be asur limka. That was the teretz of Rav, and then the Gemara says, but Rabbi Eliezer said, no, the brayso is not told in minig. The brayso is absolute. Never, ever, ever are you allowed to allow a goy to watch your behemoth daka, even though sometimes you might be able to sell to them. So what's the distinction? Rabbi Eliezer, there are places, not there are places, everywhere, it's also to be miyachid, because the goy will be reveya. Nevertheless, mutalimka. Why? What's the difference? If a goy is choshed or revia, he's choshed or revia. The teretz is when a goy is reveya an animal, it risks sterilizing the animal. It risks that this animal will no longer be able to reproduce. That takes the value out of an animal, and therefore, my timer ovid kechavim chos al behem toishalet hekar. On his own behemoth, if you sell a behemoth to him, he won't be reveya. You know why? Because it's going to cost him. But your animal, if he's watching your animal, for sure he'll be reveya. So that's the distinction. The brayso is talking about the goy being choished to reveya your animal. He definitely will. It's also to leave your animal by him. But our Mishnah that talks about selling, there are certain places where the goyim are such low lives that they're so far taivet to be reveya an animal. They'll even be reveya their own animal, even at the risk of damaging it. And in those places, it's also to sell to them. Within the makom, it's mutter to sell to them, because even though they're chashed or reveya, they will not do it to their own animals. But yachid means you're letting a goy watch your animal. Your animal, he for sure will be reveya, because it doesn't cost him anything. Right. But the Mishnah is speaking about certain cases where you could sell to them. Those are places where the goyim are not so private that they'll be able to restrain and refrain from the savera because it could cost them money. But there are certain cities where even that won't keep them back, and therefore you can't sell to them either. Zok Gemara, the Af Rav, right? Rav said a moment ago that the two Mishnayos are totally the Haderbe. He was also kosher, and he will also agree that there could be places where you're allowed to sell, but there's never a place where you're allowed to give it to a goy to watch. But if it's not his animal, you could take it to the bank that he's going to be reveya it. If anybody wants to see proof, it's available on YouTube. There's drone footage of these Hamas guys in the field shepherding in a very intimate fashion. So that applies even today. Even if you're allowed to sell a behemah gasa, you're never ever allowed to sell. Correct, Gemara. What is the reason why you're never allowed to sell a behemah gasa? My time. Even though you're not choishes for revia of a behemah gasa, why? Not because someone doesn't want to get sat on and get killed. Rashi says because they're for sure it's chasal mamoyna. A behemah gasa, they're very concerned about its well-being, and therefore they will not be reveya a behemah gasa. But ma'abed bei malacha chayshinu. We're worried that he'll do malacha with it on Shabbos if you sell it to him. Correct the Gemara in the Abed. What should be the problem with that? Even the Zavna, once you've sold this animal to the goy could do whatever he wants with his own animal. Zaktim were true, but Zara mishum she'elu mishum schiris. We're afraid that if you'll sell an animal to a goy, you'll also lend an animal or rent an animal to a goy, and then it's your animal, and he's going to do malacha with it on Shabbos. So the person is mitzvah al shvis of hemtoy, and in the meantime, every Shabbos his animal is going to be doing work while it's in the rental or loan period. Correct, Gemara, I don't understand why should that be a problem. She'ela kanya, the agra kanya. If you lend something to somebody, he's kanya to a kinyan shayman, right? He's chayav anointed. If you rent something to somebody, so he bought that time. So Viter, it's not yours. Viter, why are you concerned? Ella Rabbi Bered Rav Yeva said, Gzeira mishum nisyoni. We're afraid that while it belongs to the Yid is going to demonstrate its quality. And what will he do? The zimnin the zavna lo nahalei samach lishkiyas achama the malei shapso. What will happen is someone's going to be in the middle of negotiating a sale to sell his chamor to a goy late Friday afternoon, right before Shabbos. The animal, the seller, the yid's going to want to demonstrate this animal can carry packages good, and they'll say, tell the animal, go walk to the buyer, so the buyer can see that you're carrying a package and you're doing it well. The animal will hear his voice because the animal recognizes his voice. And the animal will go because he hears the voice of his owner. The tezel, and it's a nichale, because the person wants the animal to walk, because he wants to demonstrate to the guy that this is a good animal. And that means he actually was mechamer. He actually led his animal on Shabbos, which is a malacha d'oraisa, v'havali mechamer acher behemtoi b'Shabbos. So listen to this chashash. Since it's possible that a person might sell an animal and be negotiating close to Shabbos, and might say something that will cause the animal to be mechamer, therefore, you never, ever, ever allowed to sell an animal to a goy. Why don't they make it the content? Don't sell it on Erev Shabbos. Don't work Erev Shabbos after Chazois. I need to look into this because it seems to be a very severe gzera. Because a guy might be negotiating right before Shabbos to sell an animal, and then he might say something that will cause the animal to walk, and he's happy that it's walking because he's demonstrated that the animal's a good animal. Therefore, you're never ever allowed to sell it. Not only that, we saw in the Mishnah that the Chacham hold even if the animal is a broken animal, meaning it's an animal that you're never going to be able to demonstrate that it can carry packages because it can't. Even that, you're not allowed to sell to a guy ever. So for some reason, there's a great the Chazal saw a great need to be uber machmer when it comes to this, and it's a massive thing. I mean, you can't be in the animal business because you're not allowed to sell good animals. So I want to see if I could find a reason. If anybody heard a reason why Punkt in this particular issue, they're very, very machmer. Zogt Gemara weiter. Mask of law, Rab Shisha, Ravid. You've already quickly concluded that when you rent or when you lend an animal to somebody, he owns it, and there's no problem of Shavisas Vamta. The problem is, it's not true. The problem is, it's not true. Because, if Schir me Kanya, are you telling me that the Soicher is kind of the animal, and it's as if it's his own animal? But none we learned, Af b'makim sha'amru, lahaskir, even in places where we allow a guy to rent a piece of real estate from a yid, and that means b'chutz la'aretz, loy leveis dira amru. You're never allowed to rent a house to a guy that he's going to live in. You know why? In his own abode, in his own home, he's going to bring his getchkele, and you're not allowed to have a getchkele in your house. If you hold, when you rent something to somebody, it's theirs for the period of time that they've rented it, well, then the guy's bringing a getchkin not into your house, the guy's bringing a getchkin to his house. So therefore, why should it be a problem? Why can't I rent my house to a guy? And if the guy brings a getchkin, he's bringing it into his own house. Avodah comes a very chamer de kaver, and we don't want avodah in your house, even if it's rented out, even though it's not technically your house. You're not allowed to bring a to'eva al beisach. If you looked at Yisrael Torah, you would have known that they touch it differently. They didn't refer the to'eva to a avodah zarah. They touch it in reference to a television. Remember all this. That was the tagline. L'savi to'eva al beisach. Today they said, please bring a television on this internet. Zok the Gemara. Matkav lo Rab Yitzchak barei de Rav misharsha. Uschiris mikanya. So you've dodged a bullet. Schiris is not kind. You don't have a raya from the house, but I'll bring you a different raya that schiris is kind. But Tanan we learned Yisrael shesochar para mikoyin. This is an interesting halacha. A Yisrael rented a para from the kohen. Tosfos tells us, but he was not mekabel upon himself to feed the animal. So it's like renting a car and you get free gas. You get a gas card, you get free gas. So you rented the animal. Ya'achilena karshine truma. You're allowed to feed a truma. So you're a Yisrael. You were mafish trumas and maishas. What are you supposed to do with the trumas and maishas that you're mafish? The trumas you're supposed to give to a kohen. You don't have to give it to a kohen. You know what you could do? You could feed this animal your truma that you have to give to a kohen. So you might ask, how could you do that? Don't you have to give it to a kohen? So Rashi says an interesting twist. Even though I normally did not give my truma to the specific kohen that I rented the animal from, I might give my truma elsewhere. Here, you can feed it to the animal. You're stealing truma. Who's going to mon you? No kohen can mon you because no kohen has a specific right to your truma. So by giving it to the animal, what in essence you're doing is you're giving it to the kohen that owns the animal, because it was his animal, and I didn't accept upon myself responsibility to feed the animal. So we say it's as if you gave it to the kohen, and the kohen is, because the kohen's very happy, he's not getting it anyway. You normally don't give him your truma, but the kohen's happy that at least it's going to his animal. His animal will be well fed. So that's why you're allowed to do that. Let's see Rashi inside just to make sure that I'm not making a mistake in the heter over here. So I'm going to go to the second wide line in Rashi. Rashi says, Yachilana kashina truma, afal pishim izoynoisa alav. So Rashi argues in Tosfos. And Tosfos knows this even works if the Yisrael, the renter, was mechuyev to feed it. He didn't get a free gas card from Hertz. Still, einoi gaslin im hachila trumas kohen. If he feeds truma, which should belong to the kohen, if he feeds that to the animal, he's not a goslin. Why? Levisha truma mamish ein letovim. Really, truma is a mamish ein letovim. It belongs to the shevet of the kahuna, but no individual kohen can say it's mine. Sharei noista l'chol kohen sheyirtza. He can give it to whomever he wants, and therefore, v'imrotza hayoyachal litna l'kohen zeh shehiskaloi parasei. He could have given his truma to the renter, the oisa to the person who owns it, to the vendor. The oisa kohen mistama nichalei umochel imachila harbai kashine truma. He will for sure be moichel if those truma that he was giving, that he was virtually getting, is given to the animal, to his own animal. The malay lahakbit. Why would the kohen care? He has no rights to get the truma anyway over anybody else. So if this renter wants to use that truma to feed his animal, for sure he'll be happy. If I'm giving truma, I'm likely to be more generous with the feed for the animal because it's not costing me anything, right? If I'm the balabais and I have truma here and I'm able to feed this animal truma, I'll be generous with feeding this animal. Well, it's not costing me anything, right? So therefore, since the kohen knows that his animal will be fed ben yofa yoser misheilu hayu shaloi, even better than if it was his own food, nichalei, the kohen is happy vein gasim. So come to guys by giving the food to the animal of the kohen, it's as if you gave that kohen the truma, and that kohen is feeding it to the animal. You're just doing it direct. That's one way you can get around the gzela from the kohen. But Rashi says there's another simple way. It's not his truma that he has to give to the kohen. What the case could be is that he married a bas kohen, and his shver received this truma, and his shver gave him that truma. That truma that he's allowed to hold on to. He got it from his shver. Okay, Gavalti. This is not where the Gemara is bringing a raya from. It's the next case that we're bringing a raya. Again, we're going to bring a raya that schirish is not kohen. What's the case? The kohen shesocher parah miyisrael. A kohen that rented a parah from a Yisrael. Now that's a very good litmus test here. Because if it takes on the ownership of the kohen, then the kohen should be able to feed a truma. Because the kohen's allowed to feed his animal truma. But if it's not considered his animal, then he won't be able to feed a truma. What is the Brisa paskin? Even though the kohen accepted responsibility that he's mechuyev to feed this animal, loy yachilena kashine truma. This animal that belongs to Yisrael that he rented, that he doesn't have an ownership in, he may not feed a truma. Now that's a black and white rider. If you hold that schirus is koina, and when the renter rents something, when the kohen rented this animal, it's as if it's the kohen's animal, why can't the kohen feed this animal that he rented? Why can't he feed a truma? Para didehi. Is it not his own para? Ela shmamina, you have a raya from here that's schirus loikanya. When you rent something, yes, there is a kinyan. Of course, there's a kinyan. You have a right to keep it for 30 days and use it, but you don't have enough of an ownership in it that it's considered yours. One litmus test is whether or not, if a kohen can feed an animal that he rented, could he feed it kashin and truma? He could not. Therefore, when you're renting an animal to a goy, you will be over on shvisus behemtoi. So we have a very good reason why the chazal or goyzer don't ever sell a behemoth to a goy, because you might also rent or lend a behemoth to a goy, and there, as we've just proven, it's still technically yours. And when it works for the goy on Shabbos, you're with subal shvisus behemtoi. Now we can say that the gzeira of why Chazal said you're not allowed to sell an animal to a goy is mishum schiris and gzeira mishum she'ela, because in both those cases the animal is considered still belonging to the Yid and it's not allowed to work on Shabbos, and it's also gzeira mishum nisyoni. That doesn't discount the other chashash that we have. So we have three reasons why the Rabbanim decided that you're not allowed to sell a behemoth gasa to a goy. Now that we've established that it's osir, now we're going to find the loopholes of where it's mutter. Rav Ada Shara Lizvuni Chamra Ayada Tisafsira. If it's not a private sale, if you're not selling it on Kijiji directly to the purchaser, rather you give it over to an animal broker. So the broker is doing the sales process with the buyer, that would be allowed. Why? Let's look at the possible chashashos. If you're worried that he's going to demonstrate right before Shabbos how this animal is very good, the broker wouldn't even be able to do it. Because if the broker says go walk, the animal won't go. Because the animal doesn't recognize the voice of the broker, the animal recognizes the voice of its owner. And if the concern is that the broker might lend it or rent it, and there's a problem of shus behemtoi, that won't happen. The broker who's trying to sell it, he's only hired as a commission salesman to sell this animal. He won't lend it out, and he won't rent it out because he's not authorized to do that. And there's another reason why a broker would never ever lend out an animal. Because if I want to sell an animal, I want to play it up as a good animal. If I rent it to you, you're going to have a chance to scrutinize it, and you're going to find problems with it, and it's going to destroy the sale. I guess the Gemara holds that rent to own is not a good sales method, because once you see the details, once you become more familiar with the product than just the marketing brochure and the glossy commercial, once you're there, it's a whole different story. In other words, they say that when you see these big condos being put up, and you see the beautiful billboards with all these beautiful looking people on those billboards, they tell you not one of these people are going to live in the building. You go to the building, it's going to be full of Shmuel's neighbors. So Mamela brokers are allowed to sell. Now we have another interesting halacha. So you think you're not allowed to sell. So what did Rav Huna go and do? Rav Huna's oven, hahipara, lavkachavim. Rav Huna sold, he violated. The Mishnah says you're not allowed to, and boom, Rav Huna violated. Amalei Rav Chisda, my time, my haki. How could you violate a before sheisser? Amalei, Emer l'shchitasav. And Rashi explains, when did the Mishnah say there's an isser? That's only if it's a type of animal that you couldn't possibly have sold for shchita. For shchita, it's not a problem, because all these gzeiros don't apply. You're not worried that he's going to test it out. This is just to be shechted. So what we will say is Rav Huna learned pshat in the Mishnah. The Mishnah is speaking about when you're selling an animal that you're never going to eat. For instance, a chamor. Even a goy doesn't eat a chamor. There's a problem of all these problems in shoidi and sheila and schiras. But if you're selling an animal to eat, like a kosher animal, that wouldn't be a problem. Another pshat in Rashi is Maybe Rav Huna learned pshat in the Mishnah that the only time you're not allowed to sell an animal to a guy is if the guy says, "I'm buying this animal because I need it to work for me. I need it to remain with me." But otherwise, you can assume that the guy is buying it to shech, and then you'd be allowed to. Before we turn over the Amid, if you think about it, you're not allowed to sell an animal to a guy. That's a little bit difficult. You imagine if you're limited, that you only can sell your animal to a guy, like you could only sell it to a yid. What if there's not any yid interested in buying an animal, right? So if you look down to the bottom of the Amid, about 6 lines up in Tosfos, I'm going to draw your attention to V'yesh Loimar. The Yesh Loimar, the Vadai, Ha the author Limkor Behema Tmeya, that is an Isser to sell a Behema Tmeya, as our Mishnah details, Hanyu Dafka B'Yemeyem, Shahayu Harbe Yehudim B'Yachad. That was only in those days where Yidden lived in big Yiddish cities, and there were plenty of Jewish customers. If someone had an extra animal that he did not need, he can easily find someone to buy it from him. He wouldn't lose anything. If we're going to say that you're not allowed to sell an animal to a guy, if he can't find anybody to sell to, because he can't sell to any people in the city, they're all goyim. Yavsidena, he should lose it. He should lose. It's a big loss to lose an animal. Therefore, the Gaonim in the diaspora, Galus, said that when you live in a Goyish place surrounded by Goyim, you are allowed to sell a behemoth to a Goy. Okay, Gvaltik. Chagav Dika Kaman, you find another situation. So let me just skip now to Upasuk Rabbeinu Baruch. So Rabbeinu Baruch Paskin, the Lefizeh, even though, so the Lefizeh was what we just learned is that in the case of Evshar, where you can't survive if you're not going to sell to a guy, you're allowed to sell to a guy. Which means the holy heter is if you're stuck. So therefore, Rabbeinu Baruch, Lefizeh, you bought a sus, you thought you would need it for your avoda, and whatever happened, you found out that it was redundant, you didn't need it. But so now you're stuck with a one-off horse. Why should you take a loss? You'd be allowed to sell it even to a guy. But that doesn't mean you're allowed to go into the animal business. They didn't totally be mavatal the iser. Expressly for the purpose of doing business, that you're not allowed to do. That's usher. Because if you're stuck with an animal, memelo, you could sell it as a one-off. But to go into the animal business, that you're not allowed to do because you're violating an issue of the Mishnah. Okay. Zok the Gemara weiter. Umino Taimra Damrinon ki hagav. How do you know that, as Rashi says, the heicha, the ikadem lemisli b'mechira, the lefnei iver talin lekula. The ches changed it. It should read better. But how do you know you could be toila lekula, and say that he's buying it l'shchita and not to use, not to work with? How do you know that Rav Huna's heter is a legitimate heter? Zok the Gemara, that's not we learned. If you have a person that you know is not makbid on Shemitah, and he does work on Shemitah, you wouldn't be allowed to sell him a para that is normally used to plow with, because basically you're enabling him to violate the Shemitah. So la yimkar adam para hachareshes b'shvius uvesilel matirin. Beisilel, you're allowed to. You know why? So clearly, Beis Hillel Shita demonstrates that who said when you're selling him the para, he's going to use it to plow. He can just as easily shecht it and eat it, and therefore you would be allowed to sell to him. So this Beis Hillel demonstrates that who I did in our case, if you could say that maybe he's buying it to shecht, that would also be a reason why you would be allowed to sell to the guy. I'm sorry? No. We're saying since it's a behemoth kshera and it's not a behemoth tmeya like a donkey. A donkey, you know for sure he's only buying for the load. But a para, he might be buying it to plow, but he might be buying it to eat. That's good enough. Omar Rabba midami. You cannot bring a rye from there. Now there is a discussion if this is Rabba or Rava, And the reason why this is a discussion is because later on the Amud, we're going to hear another statement from Rabbah that contradicts this statement. So therefore, there are those who change the gears. So Amar Rabbah, mi dami. Can you compare the two cases? The case of Beis Hillel to our case. Hasam, ein adam metzuva al shvisas behemtoi b'shvias. There is no isser for your animal to do work. Punkt, there's not allowed to do work, so you're not allowed to enable them. But there's no problem that your animal itself is causing you to be over in a. But hacha, in our case, when you're selling or renting a behemoth to a goy, adam metzuva al shvisas behemtoi b'Shabbos. You're not allowed to have your animal work on Shabbos. There's a prohibition on you. By Shemitah, there's no prohibition on me for you to do an Aveira. Okay, I'm not supposed to enable you. But by selling you my animal, maybe it's not called enabling you. You might be bargaining for something else. But if you would rent or lend an animal to a guy, you're actually violating an Isser on your own because you're mitzvah al shvisus behemtoi. So therefore, just because over there we'll say he probably bought it l'shchita, who said that when there's a chash that you yourself are being over an Isser, how do you know that then it would be mutter? Amalei Abaye, I think that's a faulty. Abaye asked on Rabbah, I think your distinction is not a good distinction. And I'll prove it to you. V'chol heicha, the adam mitzuva, osir. So you tell me that's the distinction, that since here I'm going to be over myself, because it's my behemoth that's going to be doing malach on Shabbos. That makes it worse. I'm going to show you a case where it's not like that. Vare soda, a field. The adam mitzuva al shvitza sadeyu b'shvias. You're mechuyev not to work on your field on the Shemitah year. You're mechuyev to leave your field barren on the Shvius year. V'tanan we learned Beishamai oimrim lo yimkar adam soda near b'shvias. What if you have a field that you already plowed and it's ready to be planted? You shouldn't sell that to a person who's choshen on Shvius. You know why? Because he might just go and plant there, and you're enabling him to do an aveir. But ubeisil matirin it's mutter. Just because it was plowed, that doesn't mean for sure he has to plant. He could still leave it barren. So here you have a field which you are mechuyev in its shvisa. Nevertheless, zok beisilo, you're allowed to sell it. So zok Abaye to Rabbah, your distinction was never a good distinction in the first place. So therefore, you do have a raya from Beis Hillel that the same way you'll say by the Parach Hareshes, that you'll say maybe he sold it l'shchita and therefore you're allowed to sell it to a Yidus Choshen on Shemitah. So too in our case, if you could say that the animal that he sold to the goy was going to eat, it wouldn't be a problem. Gewaltig. Now the Gemara is asking a theoretical question. Maska Flo Rav Ashi. Maska Flo Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi is asking a kasha on Rabbah. Now we already Abaye already discounted Rabbah, but nevertheless, Rabbah had a svara. He said if a person is amatzuvah himself, then there would be a heter, right? Because Hasam ein adam matzuvah shusav hemtoi. Beis Hillel said you're allowed to sell an animal to a yid who is choshed on Shemitah. There you're allowed to. Why? Because it's not an aver that's really on you. That sheet itself, Rav Ashi wants to probe. What about Caleb? All right, Caleb, the ein adam mitzvah shvisas Caleb shvias. There's no isser for your farm tools to be used on the Shemitah year. There's an isser for you to do work on the field. There's an isser for your field to be worked on, but there's no isser for your tools to be used. Nevertheless, utnan Elohein Caleb she'ein adam rishai lemoicham b'shvias. The following list of Caleb are not allowed to be sold to someone who's choshed on Shvius. And what are they? Hamachreisha, a plow, the chol keleh, and all its associated parts, ha'oil, a yoke, v'amizor is a pitchfork, v'adoker is a hoe. All these things you're not allowed to sell on Shemitah. Why not? He could be using them for other things. Maybe he could be using them for next year. So, and nevertheless, you see there's an Isser. So Rabbah's whole theory that it's totally in whether or not the Isser is on you to have those items used, that would determine whether or not you're allowed to sell it to a chassid is not true. Because Kalim breaks that mold. Because kalim are things where you're for sure not mitzvah on prohibiting your kalim from doing work on Shemitah, yet you're still not allowed to sell. Any way you could find a reason to allow the sale and say that the Zara is not applicable here, you could say. The Apagav the mitzvah. And even though you're mitzvah, so it has nothing to do with whether or not your item is a problem. It's merely, in each case, you look at it with its own merits, do we have the concern or not? So the kalim are ein mitzvah, right? There's no isser for your kalim to be used on Shemitah. So why is it that we don't let you sell kalim to a pesheya? The teretz is, you could say maybe he's buying it for next year. So Rashi tells us that these tools are always available. You can go to Home Depot any time of the year. It's not seasonal. Whenever you want, you can buy these tools. So why are you buying them now for a year in advance? Nobody buys things a year in advance if it's something that's readily available. So the fact that he's buying it now clearly shows that he's planning to use it for Isser. That's why Kalim are worse. I guess nobody gives a good deal. Okay, Kavalti. So that is this sugi. Zok the Heilige Gemara of Heiter. Rabba, now we have another exception to this. Rabba Zavin Hahu Chamra L'Yisrael Hachoshid Limkor La'ibit. Rabba didn't sell his donkey to a goy, didn't violate the Mishnah, but he sold it to another Yid, and that Yid didn't care about the halachas. That Yid would equally sell to a Yid or to a goy. So Abaye told Rabba, how can you do that? Amalei Abaye, my timer, Ovid Marhochi. How can you do something like this? Amalei, he said, Anoli Yisrael Zavini. I sold it to a Yid. What's the problem? Amalei, so Abaye told him, what do you mean? But the problem is the guy you sold it to will now turn around and tell it to a guy. So Rabbi told him back, I don't know what the problem is. Who said he's going to sell it only to a guy? Maybe he'll sell it to a Yid, just like I sold it to a Yid. So therefore, I don't have to be worried I'm allowed to sell it. That was Rabbi's argument. Now the problem is, here Rabbi seems to be a very big proponent of selling things to selling someone who you're not allowed to sell to. That's our Rabbi. Up there at the top of Ramad, we had Rabbi attacking Rav Huna and saying you're not allowed to sell. So because of that, there are those who change the Rabbah up on top of the Amid to Rava. There's other terutzim as well, but that's why there's a question. So that is Rabbah's theory. Rabbah's theory is that since the person that I sell to, even if he's choshet to sell to a goy, but he could sell to a yid as well, therefore it's not my problem. Esvei, let's ask a kasha on Rabbah. Mokam shenahagu limkar behema daka lukusim moichin, shaloi limkar ein moichin. So it's mashma clearly from here that a place where the minhag is not to sell to kusim, you don't sell, because I guess kusim are also choshed on revia. My time. What is the reason why you might not be able to sell a behema daka to a kusim? If it's because you're choshed that they will be revei the animal, right? That's the whole reason why we would prohibit the sale of a behema daka. But I'm going to prove to you that we're never choshed kutim of such abhorrent behavior. How do we know this? From the following brayso. The time we learned. And this Gemara, we're going to learn Rashi that blew my brain apart. Mamish blew my brain apart. The time we learned, Ein mamidim behema b'pudakoyis shel oivdei kaychovim. You're not allowed to allow your animal to be watched by a goy. Even zacharim eitzel zacharim. Even if your animal is male and you're giving it to a male to watch, so you're still worried. So not only are we worried about sodomy, we're worried about or bestiality. It's called. No, we're worried about LGBTQ bestiality, homo bestiality. That's how we're worried. That's what it's saying. So you would wonder, why can't you leave the caves on the caves? What are they going to do? Rashi says it's because in the Goyish Welt, it's common for men to come visit women, even though let's say they have two couples and one man visits the other couple. What if he comes to visit the other couple and his friend's not there and his friend's wife is there by herself, right? And if she rejects his advances, he'll go for the female animals and that's why you're not even allowed to have females that sell females. I was about to say that she's probably highly insulted. You're going for the animal. Zok to Gemara. The animal is probably cleaner than you. So, even Zacharim Eitzel Zacharim and the Kevis Eitzel the Kevis. Then Tzarech Loimer Avoda, it's pachit. You're not allowed to give the Kevis Eitzel Zacharim. You're not allowed to give your female animal to a male to watch, or Zacharim Eitzel the Kevis, because even the women would be mizana with animals. And the Ein Moisrin Behema Leroya Shalahen. You're not allowed to hire a shepherd, a goyish shepherd, because once again we're choshit that he'll be revered animal. And the ein miyachad imon, you're never allowed to seclude yourself with a goy because the goy could kill you. The goy is choshit or ritzicha. You're not allowed to be miyachad with a goy. And now look at this line here. The ein moishrin lohem tinik lelamdoi sefer. You're not allowed to hire a goy to teach something to your child. Ulalamdoi umnus. Why not? Why would you say you're not allowed to allow a goy to watch and be secluded with your young son? Why would you say it's also? I would say because you don't want him to molest your son, and you have a duty to protect your son, right? Would you not agree? Rashi doesn't say that. Look at this. Bomb blew my brain apart. Dr. Rashi made most of them. You know why? Because the mashkele leminus. First of all, he's going to influence your son poorly. But va'oid misham mishkav zachar. And what's the problem with Mishkav Zachar? Not because you want to protect your son from being molested. No, it's because the Hein Musar Nalov. It's lift the Iver, Dichsiv, Vidavak, Mishtav, Eloy Zachar. So Imam Yishmael is so fascinating. It's a list of Shirashi. Halachically, there's no problem with being Yachim with the son. You don't want to be Mashal the Goy, but lift the Iver, does talk with it. Right? So when I read this Rashi, I thought Rashi was saying, what do you mean you have to protect your son? You have to protect him from meanness. You got to protect him from molesting. No, that's not a problem. The main thing is that the Goy shouldn't do nothing. I just thought this Rashi was a very big eye-opener to the attitude of people towards these things back then. And back then even means the 70s. I just thought that was very interesting. Aval, however, mamidim behema bepun the koyish shal kusim schorim. But you are allowed to let animals stay by male kutim. I'm sorry, shal kutim zechorim eitz on the keves, when the keves eitz on zechorim. And kol shekei ben tzarech loimer zechorim eitz on zechorim, when the keves eitz on the keves. And umoishrin behema leroy shalahen. So clearly they're not choshut. They're not choshut on revia. And in miyachad imahim, you're not choshut. You're not choshut on shvichas damim either. So you're allowed to seclude yourself with a kuti. And in moishlam tidik lelamde sefer or lelamde umnus, because you're not choshut them for violating your children or for influencing them in a bad direction. So it's a steer over here. The beginning of the Brisa said there are certain places where you're not allowed to sell a behema daka to a kuti. Obviously, we're choshid for revia, but by the end of this Brisa, it's quite clear that you're not choshid a kuti for revia. V'oy Tanya, we have another Brisa. It says ein moichin lahem loy zayin v'loy klei zayin. You're not allowed to sell a goy. You're not allowed to sell a goy weapons or tools with which you could make weapons, because they're going to use it against you. You're not allowed to sharpen their weapons. You're not allowed to masaden, which was some type of foot restraint. If they were going to be capturing a yid, they would put him into shackles, so they would restrain his feet. There are also some type of chains that are used to restrain somebody. Which are also big chains. All of these chain devices that are used to restrain somebody, you're not allowed to sell those to a guy. And it says echad oived kechavim, the echad kuti, even to a kuti you can't. My time, why wouldn't you be able to sell these things to a kuti? If it's because you're choshid a kuti to kill somebody, to kill a yid just like you are a guy, how could you say we're choshid them? We just said a minute ago, you're allowed to be miyachad with a kuti because they're not choshid al-ritzich. So that's what our problem is here. We have mixed messages. There are certain brises which seems to indicate that they're not choshid on revia and they're not choshid on ritzichas tamim and on shvichas damim or ritzicha, and we have a brisa that says they are choshid. So what is it? Ella, the reason why you're not allowed to sell to a kuti is mishum da'asi lezvuna la'ovid kecha. It's because we're afraid they're going to turn it around and sell it to a guy. So Rabba, your whole shita was based on the fact that I'm allowed to sell to a yid. It's none of my business who the yid will sell to. The yid might sell to another yid who's going to sell to a guy. But here you see that we're not only concerned about selling to somebody that we're not supposed to sell to, you're even concerned about selling to somebody who you are allowed to sell to, because he might turn around and sell it to somebody who's not allowed to sell to. So it's very on you, Rabba, how were you able to sell this animal to a yid who might then turn around and sell it to a guy? There's a very big difference. Kusi lo ovid tshuva. A kusi doesn't have the same Jewish conscience as a yid, and if he's planning to sell to a guy, you're not going to be able to stop him, and he's not going to have second thoughts. As Rashi says, lo ovid tshuva lachsaboy v'lochush l'divrei chachamim she'asruhu limkor l'ovid chachamim. He's not going to change his mind. But Yisrael of tshuva, even though now he's a Yisrael that would sell to a guy, you never know. In a minute, he might just change his mind and not sell. And therefore, I still maintain Zok Rabba, I'm allowed to sell to a Yid who's Chosh. Just like we said, you're not allowed to sell to a guy, so now it's checkmate on Rabba. You, Rabba, sold an animal to a Yid because you thought that who said I'll sell to a guy, you see that's absolutely not allowed. So Rabbah felt terrible that he sold wrong. So he wanted to buy back the animal that he sold to the Yid, no matter what the cost would be. Roid Basrei plus a Parsi. He ran after the person who he wrongfully sold this animal to. 3 parsoyas he ran. V'ikadamri parsa, bechala. He ran only a parsa, but it was a very difficult terrain to run over. He was not able to reach him, so he felt bad because he did want to buy it back because he felt he did violate, but he couldn't do it, couldn't fix it. Yisrael. The same way you're not allowed to sell these weapons to a guy, you're also not allowed to sell these weapons to a Jew, a gangster, who will also use them to hurt a Jew. If you're really concerned that this Jewish gangster will kill you, he's like a Meir Lansky, that was his name, the guy who owned Murder Incorporated. So of course you're not allowed to sell him. And if he wouldn't kill a Jew, why can't you sell him weapons? Really, he wouldn't kill. We're talking about a guy who steals from people, and hopefully the people won't resist. But if they resist, they'll have to fight back, as Rashi says. And then they grab money and they rob. If the victim runs after them to pursue them, then he'll fight back. So that's what we're talking about. The zimnin, the ovid latzul nafshe. Therefore, you shouldn't sell to them. Tandra abanan and marchanam treason. You're not allowed to sell them shields. Shields is a defensive weapon. V'yesh armin marchanam treason. There are those that you could because it's defensive, but there are those told you can't. We'll have to see why. My time. If the reason why you're not allowed to sell them is because it protects them, and you don't want to protect gangsters. You don't want to protect them. So then if you're worried about protecting them, so then, and you're not allowed to sell something that they can protect themselves with, so you shouldn't even be able to sell them food, because you want them to die. You don't want to protect them. Omarav, Zotrav, I'll tell you what it is. If you don't sell them fruit, you don't sell them food, that will create a tremendous ava. That you can't avoid. But a weapon, you can say, I don't want to sell you a weapon. That you can get away with. If you can avoid selling it to them, even food, you should avoid it. But if they'll be able, you don't have a choice. Ikadamri, Tristan Taima, the law, you know why you can't sell a shield? The Chishalam Zinayu. If he used up his artillery and he used up his not his weapons, but the bullets. What are the bullets called? Munitions. If he uses up his munitions, Katli Begavayu, he'll even use the shield to whack someone's head off with. So therefore, it also acts as a proactive, as an attacking weapon, as an offensive weapon. Okay, we'll stop here, and we'll be mamshich tomorrow.